Well, as we've said many times already today, this is the first Sunday of Advent, and I'm going to be using a couple of traditional Advent lectionary texts in my lessons for today. Often in Advent, the texts have to do with what is called that day, or the day of the Lord, and that relates in a way to the end of time and the expectation that God will someday come among us. And sometimes those texts have sort of a hopeful slant. Sometimes they are full of warning, and I think you're going to hear one of each kind today. So first I'm going to read from Isaiah chapter 2, verses 1 through 5, and this comes from the Message translation of Scripture. Hear the word of the Lord from Isaiah. The message Isaiah got regarding Judah and Jerusalem. There's a day coming when the mountain of God's house will be the mountain, solid, towering over all mountains. All nations will river toward it. People from all over set out for it. They'll say, "Come, let's climb God's mountain. Go to the house of the God of Jacob. He'll show us the way he works, so we can live the way we're made." Zion's the source of the revelation. God's message comes from Jerusalem. He'll settle things fairly between nations. He'll make things right between many peoples. They'll turn their swords into shovels, their spears into hoes. No more will nation fight nation. They won't play war anymore. Come, family of Jacob, let's live in the light of God. And then from Matthew chapter 24, verses 36 to 44, and this is going to be in the New Revised Standard Version. In this text, Jesus is speaking to his disciples about what he calls the coming of the Son of Man, which again is also about the end of the age. These are Jesus' words. "But about that day and hour no one knows, neither the angels of heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. For as the days of Noah were, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For in those days before the flood they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day Noah entered the ark. And they knew nothing until the flood came and swept them all away. So too will be the coming of the Son of Man. 2 will be in the field, 1 will be taken and the other left. 2 women will be grinding meal together, 1 will be taken and 1 will be left. Keep awake, therefore, for you do not know what day your Lord will be coming. But understand this, if the owner of the house had known in what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and would not have let his house be broken into. Therefore, you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an unexpected hour." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Well, as you know, Pastor Paul likes to begin his sermons with jokes that may or may not have much to do with what he is then going to go on to say. I prefer, whenever I can, to begin with a story about one of my grandchildren. Some of you may have seen 2 of the 4 grandchildren a couple of weeks ago. Isaac and Grace were here because their parents were at a conference in Notre Dame, and David and I were taking care of them. Isaac, at 3.5, is our youngest grandchild, and he is just full of imaginative ideas and stories. And at one point during his visit, he said to me, "Mimi, did you know that the Bible happened a long time ago?" "Yes, Isaac, I did know that. But," he went on, "it might still be happening on another planet. But it's nothing to worry about." Well, I'm kind of relieved to know that though the Bible may still be happening on another planet, it's not something I need to worry about. I'm relieved because as a child, I was a little bit worried about some parts of the Bible. I was raised in a home where the second coming of Christ was really emphasized, and I was always a little bit afraid of that idea. And our gospel lesson for today was a source of some of that fear. I was afraid that Jesus might indeed show up when I least expected it, and my mother and my father would be taken with him, but I would be left behind. That phenomenon was called the rapture, and I waited in dread for it to happen. Only as an adult studying this text did I come to realize that the ones who were left behind, the ones, that is, who were not taken away to be judged, were really the blessed ones in this story. But that was not the way that text was interpreted in the church of my childhood. Advent is a time of waiting. Of course, as we heard from the children, it's a season when the youngest among us are waiting for the coming of Christmas, for the coming of Santa Claus. But more than just the coming of Christmas, it's a season when we remember that God's people are, in a sense, always waiting. It's a season when we remember that Israel waited in great hope for the coming of the Messiah. And when we remember that we are waiting as well for the coming again of Jesus, the King, and the coming in of the fullness of his kingdom. But are we waiting for something fearsome, something destructive? Or are we waiting for the coming of a joyful and peaceful new reality like the one described in Isaiah? Are we waiting for coal in our stockings or for gifts under the tree? On this, the Hope Sunday of Advent, I am certainly hoping for the latter. But in our world, is such a hope merely a pipe dream? Is it rather naive? Some of you may have seen the classic movie about World War I, All Quiet on the Western Front. And in one scene in that movie, a couple of soldiers are talking, and one of them asks, "Where do wars come from anyway?" And another one replies, "Well, one country gets mad at another country, and they start fighting." Then the first soldier asked, rather sarcastically, "Do you mean that one piece of land gets mad at another piece of land?" "No. The people of one country get mad at the people of another country." And with that, the first soldier picked up his rifle and started walking away. "I'm going home. I'm not mad at anyone." Well, we know that it's not quite that simple, don't we? You veterans whom we honored a couple of weeks ago know that it is not that simple. In a world of nuclear weapons and IEDs and terrorism, we know that it's not that simple. And anyone who thinks it is that simple may be a bit simple or naive themselves. Or are they maybe just expressing the peacenik's dream, like in John Lennon's wistful song, Imagine? Here are some of the words of that song. "Imagine there's no countries. It isn't hard to do. Nothing to kill or die for, and no religion, too. Imagine all the people living life in peace. You may say that I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday the world will be as one." Well, was Isaiah the prophet with his hopeful vision of peace out of touch with reality? Was he perhaps just a bit simple or naive? Or did he just have a vivid imagination like John Lennon or my grandson? Probably not. Probably not, because he, along with all the people of Israel, knew a great deal about violence and war. They knew a lot about enemies, and unlike the soldier in the movie, they were mad at somebody. When Isaiah spoke these words, his people had been humiliated. Their temple had been destroyed, and many of the people had been carried off into captivity in a foreign country. And yet, in the midst of that reality, here is Isaiah with this vision of peace. And he acts as if it's not just wishful thinking or a pretty but empty hope. He states it as if it is a fact, something that will happen. He paints an incredible picture of all other nations, Israel's enemies and Israel's friends, coming one day in long, joyful lines to the house of the God of Israel. And they will come not in order to plunder or to destroy, but to learn God's ways from God's downtrodden people. War will be forgotten, and God will be the peace between all of them. And God's way will be the way of all of them. In Isaiah's holy imagination, he sees all the strange and diverse people in the world coming together as God's own people. Again, he sees a long stream of people with little in common, people of different races and with different religions and probably with different political points of view, different ages, all finding their place as God's beloved people. Well, it doesn't take much looking around at our world or just at our nation to know that we are not there yet. There's a lot of warfare and destruction. There are a lot of enemies. There are many divisions between us. But every once in a while, we're given glimpses of that hope in action. Our son Nathan and his family live in the Bay Area of California, which is a very ethnically and religiously and racially diverse region of the country. And after the recent election, there were parents at my grandson Oscar's elementary school who were aware that their children were frightened about the election results. They had overheard the overblown rhetoric of the campaign, and some were afraid for themselves or for their friends. So those parents got their children together to do some poster making. And the next day at school, as the kids all lined up to go into the building at the start of their day, there were several children holding signs with big hearts drawn on them, and the words, "Everyone belongs here." Everyone belongs here. Oh, that little multicultural, multiracial lineup of children, sprinkled with its little hopeful cardboard messages, seemed to me to be a contemporary picture of Isaiah's winsome vision of all kinds of people streaming to God's temple where all belong. Let me give you one more picture, and this is a very different picture. In his book, Rumors of Another World, Philip Yancey describes a reconciliation hearing in South Africa several years ago. At this hearing, a policeman by the name of Vanderbroek confessed how he and other officers had shot an 18-year-old boy at point-blank range and then had burned his body to cover up the evidence. And he went on to describe how 8 years later, he had returned to the boy's home and forced his mother to watch as he bound her husband, poured gasoline on him, and set him on fire. When he finished with his story, the judge asked the boy's mother, "What do you want from Mr. Vanderbroek?" And she replied, "I want him to go to the place where my husband was burned and gather up the dust there so that I can give him a decent burial." Mr. Vanderbroek, with his head down, nodded his assent. And then she said, "Mr. Vanderbroek took away my family from me, but I have a lot of love to give. Twice a month, I would like for him to come to my home and spend the day with me so I can be a mother to him. And I would like Mr. Vanderbroek to know that he is forgiven by God and that I have forgiven him too. I'd like to embrace him so that he can know my forgiveness is real." I hope that none of us ever have to forgive that much. But that is the kind of holy witness and action that might lead even our enemies to stream to the mountain of God, there to learn with us the ways of God. Can we imagine it? Ignatius Loyola, who was the founder of the Jesuits, encouraged Christians to engage in an exercise in which they saw themselves standing before God, and there in the presence of God, imagining what they would like their lives to proclaim. What in our imaginations do we want our lives to proclaim? Well, this kind of imagining and the witness and action of that South African woman and those little children in California, I believe, are examples of what it means to stay awake and to stay alert to God's ways as we wait for Jesus. None of us knows how long we will have to wait. None of us knows how long we will live. Jesus challenges each one of us, whatever time we have, to live in this bold, visionary kind of way. Many biblical scholars, by the way, think that this passage in Matthew is not really only talking about some great cataclysmic day at the end of time, but about the end of each one of us. And whether this is the case or not, our waiting is not a pie in the sky, by and by kind of waiting. It is wakeful and alert and full of actions that demonstrate that we believe in the hopeful vision that God gave to Isaiah. May this be the way that we wait. And as we are nourished at this table today by the God who has lots of love to give, by the God who has forgiven us every hateful thing that we have ever done, may we be filled with hope and with a deep and abiding joy. Amen.